Fiends piled on top of Hoplite, the chain constricting around his neck as several pairs of fists wailed ineffectually at his armor. "You're finished now." He heard the fiend mock. "All that armor and speed proved useless against me, and my horde now suffocate." Idiot. Hoplite clipped the Fortis to his thigh, reaching up to grasp the chain around his neck, unbothered by its constriction. If Tolak had understood anything about Adium, he would have known that it couldn't bend. Trying to strangle Hoplite was useless. He yanked on the chain, feeling something come forward with minimal resistance. As that happened, he attacked the horde piling onto him with the Sectus, parting limb and flesh until again he could see the sky above. Tolak stood there, both hands grasping the other side of the chain, as his heels dug into stone to resist being dragged. Now that he was somewhat immobilized, this would be simple, even with his ability to phase. He hacked his way toward the fiend, disemboweling mutants left and right as he wrapped the chain further around his gaunt. The other chain still battered at his helmet, floating in the air above him as it whipped. A dangerous weapon, true, but it lacked any real weight to its attacks. It was nothing compared to the blows that Tuji had dealt. He drew closer and closer to the fiend, a look of panic coming over the creature's face. It filled Hoplite with a sense of satisfaction to see that expression, to know that he had destroyed his arrogance. When finally he was within striking range, he lashed out, stabbing at Tolak's heart. Again, Tolak phased, and it was then that Hoplite discovered something. The chains themselves didn't fade away with him. Otherwise he would have lost his grasp on. Advantageous, especially seeing that Tolak also didn't lose his grip. He couldn't get away now. The blade passed through his chest, but instead of drawing it back, Hoplite held it in place. Tolak's eyes widened, and in that last instant, he tried to move away from the blade. Hoplite followed him, the blade still deep within his transparent chest as Tolak re-solidified, the Sectus embedded within him. He gave a shrill scream of agony as Hoplite twisted the blade, ripping it free with an explosion of viscera. He then planted his foot firmly on the bridge and aimed a straight jab right at Tolak's forehead. His fist collided with skin and bone, shattering it and painting the stones behind Tolak crimson. The end result of that punch left the entire upper half of Tolak's skull missing, leaving only a lower jaw and a lolling tongue. Yet, instead of falling prone, Tolak's body slowly stumbled away, the spare chain whipping around in an uncontrolled frenzy. It struck indiscriminately, lashing fiends and sending them to the ground screaming in agony. Hoplite promptly released the second chain, backing away as the two chains went wild, a dervish of blurring metal. It stripped flesh from any fiend that drew too close to its range, reducing them to little more than babbling flesh, as Tolak continued to stumble away. After that, it seemed that, as he had hoped, the horde had reverted to standard behavior. The creatures all charged him, fury and desperation in their eyes, as they tried to pry through his armor. He battered, slashed and shot, crushed and mangled his attackers, beyond any recognition. Time ceased to exist as he neutralized the surrounding threats. Eventually, all became still, leaving nothing but piles of twitching broken limbs and puddles of gore. He was covered nearly head to toe in blood as he approached the now quiet rest stop, still clutching the Sectus tightly as he did so. Hopefully casualties would be at a minimum, but he would see for sure once the giant fiend from earlier, then rounded the corner, a strange look of serenity on its face. Had it managed to It couldn't have actually. He charged, drawing the Fortis as the creature raised its hands, palms out. Wait. It screamed as the rest of the squad emerged from the tunnel behind it. Chapter 11. Onslaught Twindle. Cursed as she rushed into the tunnel, the ravening horde in hot pursuit. There had to be hundreds of the accursed creatures out there, if not more. She turned her head to see Michael still standing there, a blank expression on his face, as he stared at the looming darkness ahead. She turned on her heel, rushing past the others to reach him. She may not have known him all too well, but Twindle wasn't about to allow the Outworlder to suffer a fate worse than death. When she was about halfway to him, he seemed to snap out of his stupor, flicking on the lightcaster affixed to the side of his helmet before running to meet her. "Are you all right?" she asked, running by his side as the others urged them along. They all stood just in front of the wagon, waving and shouting for them to hurry. Lance particularly looked stressed, green eyes wide as she practically shouted through closed teeth for the two of them to run faster. Michael didn't respond, neither to Twindle or the party's shouts. He somehow managed to look both determined and terrified as his light illuminated the blackness before him. The light that bled in from the outside barely reached the wagon, and everything behind it seemed to be pitch black aside from where his lightcaster illuminated. That was right. He had intense nyctophobia from his time trapped in that rotting sarcophagus. She truly hoped that he'd be all right. Michael might be horribly vulgar, but he didn't deserve to become cursed by spiraling death. If he froze up again during this encounter, however, that might just be his fate. Hopefully this newfound bravery would hold fast against the coming tide. By the time they both reached the wagon, the horde rounded the corner, quickly flooding into the corridor. Indeed, it did seem as if it were a flood, for the fiends trampled over one another in such a way that they seemed to be a purple typhoon. She could see several of the poor creatures get crushed by their fellows, no doubt leaving dozens of them with shattered bones. The sight of the looming threat nearly forced her to take a step back, terror temporarily seizing her in its icy grip. Her features hardened, holding the grip of her sword firmly as she stood before the accursed. No fear, no anger, just... Now that she was calm, she could be able to eat this, you bunch of purple people eaters. Michael shouted loudly, before promptly flicking a switch on his rifle. Thunder flashed in the darkness, briefly illuminating the dim corridor as dozens of fiends simply collapsed to the ground in bleeding heaps. Her sensitive ears rang after the first shot, leaving all other sounds nigh inaudible. Several fiends fell to the ground, though they did not bleed from what she could see in the dim light. Instead, they clutched their ears, their mouths agape in a silent scream. At least it was silent to her ears. She spared a brief glance at Michael, seeing those bright blue eyes wide with borderline madness. His mouth worked, still shouting as he unloaded an entire magazine, as he had called it, into the horde. Despite the inconvenience to her hearing, the enclosed tunnel meant that sound would be amplified. And with how loud that gun was, it would cause temporary pain in the form of ringing ears. Temporary for everyone, except for fiends. The ones that fell bucked and writhed, enclosing their ears with their hands in an attempt to drown out the horrid ringing in their eardrums. Not all of the fiends fell, however. Some powered through the ringing pain, trampling over those who fell in their mad rush to reach the party. After a couple seconds, Michael's gun stopped firing, and she saw, as he quickly ejected the spent magazine, slotting in a fresh one in as little as 2 seconds before, Again he began firing. The horde was closing fast, however, and the barrage of bullets served only to slow them by a hair. Michael backed away, still shooting until the next magazine was spent. Again she spared the briefest glance for him, seeing the man climb into the back of the wagon before he once again reloaded. She then turned her attention back to the horde, seeing the angel Baumia rushing forward. Alistair had thankfully managed to summon the being just in time. The creature would prove invaluable in this conflict. An angel couldn't contract the curse after all. They were a being not made of true flesh. Massive ape-like fists smote and crushed all that they met, Baomiel's humanoid upper half conjuring a long spear sword of light that severed head and limb with ease. The beast parted the sea of fiends around it, the two separate streams hugging the wall to move past the angel and reach the party. Twindle drew on Athena's piece, raw foundation funneling towards the goddess for conversion. It flowed back into Twindle like a spike of ice piercing her back, sending chills up her neck as it suppressed all the fear within her. She channeled that freezing piece into her blade, an aura of white surrounding both herself and her sword. It used to be that she could only channel this power into her weapon. It was only recently she'd learned to expand its reach. She was faster now, stronger, but most importantly, completely tranquil. Even as the horde finally reached them, she felt no fear. She brought her blade down upon the first fiend, a skinny husk with wispy white hair, bisecting it laterally before she struck again. Her sword cleaved through the top half of a skull, sending the cap splattering to the stones. Another barrage of bullets rang out from the wagon, sending another dozen fiends crashing to the stones in agony, either from fresh wounds or clutching at their ears as the ringing of their ears intensified. She caught a glimpse of Nalvi, standing directly behind Alistair with the veins leading to her eyes. Bulgins more collapsed from just her mere stare, fresh lashes appearing across their exposed flesh. Had she wished it, Nalvi could have inflicted more grievous wounds upon the fiends, but it would have been wasted effort. The stripping of flesh would serve better to deal with the cursed, overwhelming them with pain to the point of collapse. Alistair opted for the opposite, conjuring raw foundation, the golden flame, enveloping his hammer before he swung it in a wide arc. The head of the hammer collided with several fiends, the golden flame completely enveloping whatever it came into contact with. The sun-like radiance stuck to the fallen fiends for only seconds before they were reduced to white ash. Yet these brief instants proved to be catastrophic to the incoming horde. The creatures would scramble to try and make it to Alistair, moving over the still-burning bodies of their fellows. Soon a bonfire of foundation lit the surrounding darkness, slowly spreading outward as more fed the fire. All Alistair had to do was maintain it, but the larger this fire became, the more difficult it would be for him to control. He could potentially burn himself out, even with his innate talents. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to be spreading fast enough to disintegrate the rest of their attackers, but it was making a noticeable dent in their forces. Kidka moved as a blur to her right, his sword biting through cursed flesh, almost too quickly for her eyes to see. Lance stayed just behind him, where only a few fiends could surround her. The vast majority on this side of the tunnel charged directly for Twindle and Kidka, but a group of about 10 opted to head straight for the Watcher, a harrowing amount of foes for one pure mortal to face. But thankfully Lance was very capable with those twin blades she carried. Her long dark hair swirled as she lopped a fiend's hand off at the wrist, stabbing her other blade through its throat before promptly ripping it free, leaving a fontaining wound in its place. She didn't have time to see how she would handle the other 9, her attention now firmly on the looming figure, now standing at the end of the tunnel. She'd caught a glimpse of that one before they had to retreat into the rest stop. If it was alive in here, did that mean that Hoplite had been slain? She found that thought hard to believe, but she seriously doubted that the Outworlder would allow this thing to get past. Perhaps that other fiend, the one with the chains, had Hoplite occupied. Survive this battle, and you'll find out, she thought to herself, as she cleaved apart another group of the accursed. A stream of smoking green liquid then shot out like a geyser from her left, spattering against purple flesh and melting it clean off the bone in seconds. The acid then ate through bone before that too disappeared, turning whatever it touched into a screaming mass of sloughing flesh. The acid left bubbling puddles in the setstone, stripping the flesh off the feet of any fiends that opted to pass across it. Elam's acid couldn't have been timed more perfectly, catching many of the creatures in the blast. These too fell over one another, leaving the melting fiends to be trampled underfoot as the horde pressed on. With how proficiently they all were controlling this crowd, it seemed as if the party's victory was inevitable, assuming they could keep this up. The line of the accursed still stretched far, and more still emerged from the corner every second. Besides the stream of fresh fiends, the massive creature was coming closer, taking slow, struggling steps as it plowed forth over its crippled kindred. It was on her side of the tunnel, meaning that the first one it would come into contact with would be her. She was not daunted by the size of this cursed orc. A single quick slash from her blade would reduce it to a screaming mess. In fact, she might not even have to fight this thing at all. A single shot from Michael's rifle would do the job, and right as she had the thought, the thing's chest was riddled with bullets. However, instead of penetrating the flesh as expected, they pinged right off its skin, ricocheting off the surrounding walls before finding a home in weaker flesh. Something then whizzed right past her ear, plinking off into the darkness of the tunnel behind her. Her eyes widened as realization dawned on her. One of those stray rounds had almost hit her in the head. She had not the steel flesh of Tuji, meaning that, by the pillars, she had almost died. She had the blood of a god running through her veins. But bullets didn't seem to discriminate based on lineage, don't. They'd put holes in whatever they could. She'd need to keep that in mind for the future. The creature seemed almost completely unaffected by that barrage, pressing forward with a loud grunt. At least, that's what its mouth seemed to motion. She couldn't hear anything still. Well, for the most part. She was certain that Michael had just shouted some kind of derogatory slur at the beast before he went back to shooting the horde. In that lapse of continuous gunfire, the fiends had gained, leaving only a mere 20 paces between them and the wagon. She had no time to move over to that gap, however, for the towering orc was now upon her. Kidka wouldn't be able to aid her. He was fighting for his life, getting backed further and further into the tunnel toward Lance, as the ravening fiends sought to rend the flesh from his bones. Elam, Alistair, and Norvi too were doing everything they could to simply keep the creatures back, but they were swiftly losing ground. The flames of Foundation were slowly beginning to die down as Alistair fought on, sweat soaking his red headband as he gasped greedily for air between swings. Maintaining the flame like this was going to singe him if he wasn't careful, but what choice did he have? It was either risk being burned or succumb to the curse. She knew which option she'd choose. Gripping her blade, she rushed forth to meet the charging horde, praying to Athena that her armor would hold out against this thing. If it inflicted any pain upon her, she'd be cursed for all eternity. Twindo would not allow that to happen. She cleaved through another host of fiends that filled the space between them, her face expressionless, as Athena's peace flooded her, empowered her, the cold void freezing her fidgeting fear as she reduced bodies to twitching piles of screaming meat. The orc was before her now, rearing its shoulders back in an odd way as she held her blade at the ready. It didn't appear to be readying itself for a blow. In fact, it seemed to be trying to hold itself back. More fiends poured around it as it clenched its teeth, those big yellow eyes looking horribly agonized. She swept about her, downing dozens more as the freezing void within her held fast. Twindle's swings were faster than any mortal could track, forming a bubble of flashing steel around her. Yet still the orc did nothing, rearing back those shoulders as it stared down at her, sharp teeth clenched nearly to their breaking point. Then something strange happened. Twindle couldn't hear it, but the beast's lips moved as it spoke. The words seemed to be, "Sorry. Sorry." It mouthed again as its shoulders freed themselves from an invisible grip. A massive fist then came flying toward her, nearly catching her in the breastplate as she sidestepped the attack. The wind that passed from the force of the blow blew her hair out of her face, and she barely had time to duck under a heavy kick that was aimed for her midsection. If it wanted to kill her, it would have gone for her head, but the goal was not to end her life, it was to cause her agony. She rolled forward between the orc's legs, coming up to a kneel before swinging her sword at the orc's leg. The blade normally would have parted the flesh with ease, but it only sliced through about an inch of skin before coming to a complete halt. The shock exploded up her arms and into her shoulders, her enhanced strength reflecting back on her from the impact. She tugged hard, pulling the weapon free right as a massive hand gripped her shoulder, crushing it beneath an iron grip that crumpled the steel beneath it. Twindle's breath caught as agony exploded through shattered bone and broken steel poked through flesh. Athena's void shook within, nearly vanishing as terror washed upon it. It was over now. The curse would take hold soon. If everyone survived this battle somehow, she would request that Alistair put her down. It would be painless that way. No time to think on that now. This wound was debilitating and needed to be healed. The steel piercing her flesh would be forced out, but that section of her armor was permanently ruined. She then felt herself being lifted from the ground, her blade clattering to the stones below as fiends swarmed over it like ants on a crumb. The orc lifted her up to its face, still clutching her tightly by the ruined shoulder. Its face still looked horribly pained, but its yellow eyes had retained a certain clarity. "I'm sorry." It mouthed, "I'm so sorry. Forgive me." That's right. Wounding her had restored some cognition to this cursed monster. It was seeking forgiveness for what it had done to her. A hard thing to forgive, cursing her in this way. But she would accept the apology. Had she been in that much pain, who was to say she wouldn't have done the same? Its hand ceased crushing her shoulder, the orc moving to cradle her instead, as if she were some kind of newborn babe. "I can't stop for long," it wheezed, its voice suddenly audible. "Forgive me." Michael hadn't fired his gun in a long while, relatively anyhow. Had he been overrun? The orc then raised another shaky hand, reaching toward her other shoulder with an open palm. It sought to crush her other shoulder as well. She'd not allow this to happen. She may have already been cursed, but she needed her other hand to swing her blade. She struggled to escape the thing's grip, but it held her tightly to its chest, hardly seeming to exert any effort as it kept her immobile. She had to think, and quickly, or she'd be reduced to a useless, crippled mess, or even worse, as another fiend for her friends to fight. Yet what was she to do? Her blade could only cause a dent, and that had fallen to the ground below. She could try punching the thing, but with its steely flesh, her fists would be completely useless. She could try to blind it with magical light, but all it had to do was keep its grasp on her. There seemed to be nothing that she could do to get out of this. Unless, desperately, she reached out for foundation, allowing Athena to build her house as she gripped the orc's massive hand with her own. She gasped desperately. Be healed. Power flowed through her hand, quickly enveloping the orc in a misty white vapor. The creature froze for a moment, teeth clenching as those yellow eyes bulged. A sharp intake of breath cut through the cacophony of roars surrounding the two of them, before finally it released in a relieved sigh. Lucidity returned to those eyes, the pain-driven monster coming back to himself as he grimaced at her injury. I thank you, little one, he said, adjusting his grip to cradle her. I will help drive them off for you in the meantime. Heal yourself. That voice was no longer that of a barely constrained savage, but of an almost noble, unshakable warrior. He was right. She needed to heal herself to get back into the fighting, and to stave off the madness of becoming a fiend. Oddly enough, her skin still had yet to turn purple. She had read once that the curse completely engulfed its victim in under a minute. Time had ceased to exist after this battle had begun. Had it been minutes, hours? How long had it been since she'd been wounded by this orc? There was no time for pondering this now. She put a hand to her own shoulder, repeating the same incantation and enveloping herself within Athena's power. She felt the shards of steel being forced from her flesh, bones being knit back together, before finally her skin sealed with an audible, steam-like hiss. She dearly hoped that Hoplite would be joining them soon. Even with their new ally, they weren't likely to last much longer. Chapter 12. The Mouth of Zod. Wait. The orc screamed again as Hoplite charged toward him, blade drawn and ready to skewer the now peaceful fiend. Twindle rushed forward, stepping into Hoplite's path with her features firm. Calm yourself, and let me explain, she shouted across the span between them, her voice echoing across the bridge. Hoplite slowed his advance, coming to a hesitant stop, yet not sheathing his knife. Once he was within a few paces of her, he stopped, though his helmet never turned away from Hom. She couldn't blame him for his caution, of course, even with lucidity restored. A talking fiend was still a fiend. Michael Lance, by me now, Hoplite shouted suddenly. Stay clear of the infected. Michael, without even an instant of hesitation, rushed to his superior's side, a slight grimace on his face. Lance did not seem as eager to leap at Hoplite's word, but after a quick glance at Hom, she too ran over. Twindle briefly wondered if her hesitation could have something to do with what Hoplite had said to her earlier. Right as this conflict started, no one wanted to be told they'd be useless at anything, much less a warrior like Lance. Yet, Hoplite had been correct to tell her, and by extension the party, to retreat into the tunnel. Had they not done so, they all would have been subjected to the curse for sure. The thought of the death spiral made her grimace, a hand reaching to her now bare shoulder that Hom had shattered earlier. It had been several minutes since then, but still the curse had not taken hold. Could it have something to do with her lineage? Was she immune to the curse because of that? It was hard to say, but she'd need to keep an eye on herself. It could have just been slowed down by her divine blood, not stopped. Only time would tell. Besides that, she knew that Hoplite would be loaded with questions for why she hadn't been turned into a fiend. It hurt her to do so, but she'd need to lie or feign ignorance. She could not allow the Outworlder to suspect that she was a godling. That would surely cause segregation or outright conflict. And as of this moment, they could not afford to be apart from one another. Hoplite's nigh invulnerability ensured that he'd never be cursed, and his ability to crush entire armies of fiends would spare her friends unnecessary risk. She also didn't want to lose Lance's trust. Twindle and her had built a steady rapport during their time together. She didn't want to lose that. The Watcher was terrified of godlings, as all mortals were. Just her description of Tuji painted the half-orc as a horrific demon from myth. She had no doubt that she'd think of Twindle in that exact same light if she ever learned the truth. "Sir," Michael said after a moment, "I expended half of our ammunition. The assets were used properly private at ease." Hoplite replied. "Why is it not hostile?" he continued, tilting his helmet toward the orc. She began, removing her hand from her shoulder. "I healed him right as he was about to hurt me, and he joined our side in the battle. But you do have an injury." Hoplite pointed out. "Your armor is compromised." She hesitated. "I healed myself before the curse could spread." She lied, averting her eyes as shame filled her. Oh, how she hated lying. "It must be true," Lance said. "It would have spread over her within a minute, and she looks completely normal." "I see." Hoplite replied. "We'll keep that in mind for the future, in case any more injuries are sustained." Twindle's eyes widened a fraction at the outright acceptance of her explanation. She had expected far more scrutiny than that from him. For a moment she had been nervous that he'd open up a line of questioning that would have somehow led to her revealing her lineage. She looked to Lance, pursing her lips in thought. Was it because he trusted her word? Seeing the Outworlder put that much faith in someone that wasn't from his own realm was surprising, to say the least. "I am indebted to you, small one," the orc said suddenly, his head tilting down toward her. You have given something precious back to me. My agonies are gone now, as is the fog that occluded my thinking. I am a beast no more, and thanks to you I can resume my quest." "A quest?" Elam asked, making sure to maintain a good distance from the fiend. "You had a quest in the Fiendwood?" "Yes, it was around, say, 200 years ago now. I desired to burn the rotting Ilum and end Kazan's reign once and for all. But I was arrogant and became cursed soon after crossing the bridge," the orc said with a frown, looking past Hoplite and into the distance. "I did not lose my faculties then, rather. The pains of the years piled on, unceasing, until I became little more than an animal, no different than the poor creatures twitching at the poor creatures. Our feet. How did you find your way back to the bridge?" Alistair asked, hammer still drawn. Even with how exhausted he looked, he still appeared ready to lash out at Hom in an instant. "That monster Tolek found me and made me into his pet, for lack of better words. He promised a way to alleviate my pains, but only if I followed his every word. And with my mind and will diminished, I complied. He never let me inflict enough pain to become sane again. Only enough to keep me from collapsing. I'll never forgive myself for cursing the brave souls who sought to follow in my footsteps." His fists then clenched, his yellow eyes becoming steel as they glared toward the horizon. Now I can burn the rotting Ilum and end the curse. What are you called? Novi asked, eyes firmly locked on the ground near the orc's feet. I am Ham, the next in line to be the mouth of Zod. The orc replied, puffing out his chest to emphasize the strange growth on his right pectoral. A sort of tumor, perhaps? What did that have to do with being the mouth of Zod? And what even was that title? Kidka gasped audibly, taking a cautious step towards the towering fiend with awe. You. The tongue is in you now, Kidka asked, raising the back of his hand to reveal the tattoo of Zod's tongue. Ham's expression went from dour to cheerful in an instant. Yes, my boy. Are the rest of you tongues as well? Just me, Kidka replied quickly. We've been without a mouth for centuries, he stammered, because we'd lost the tongue. That was my fault, Ham said with a sigh. I was next in line, but still I decided to take on this damned quest, and in doing so, deprive the tongues of proper leadership. Zod hasn't spoken to any of the new tongues since my departure, something I hope to rectify once I lift the curse. I will lend you my aid, Kidka said in an unwavering tone, slamming his fist into his chest. Our goals seem to align. Would you like to travel with us? Before Ham could reply, Hoplite interjected, negative. He is a risk to the squad, and I won't let the infection spread among us. But he seeks to lift the curse and slay Kazan, Kidka shouted, and he is mighty. You should have seen him in there. You can have him be in your squad, but we will be leaving if you do. Hoplite interrupted again. It can't be trusted. Michael didn't react to his superior's words, simply standing beside him to see how things would play out. It almost came as a surprise, but Lance also raised no opposition to this idea, her hand still clutching her blades firmly as she stared at the towering form of Ham. It looked like she didn't trust the fiend either. Twindle did, but she had to admit that was only because he'd helped them fight. Everyone else likely still had reservations about being near any kind of fiend. Even one with lucidity. Well, everyone except for Kidka, apparently, whose face reddened a slight margin as he glared daggers at Hoplite's helmet. Fear not. I understand, Ham said with a sad smile. I know what I am. But allow me to grant upon you all a boon. He then pointed across the bridge, past Hoplite. Allow me to clear the bridge ahead of you. My kindred will not attack, and I do not have the need for rest. You'll be controlled by Kazan the instant you step out of bounds. Hoplite countered. Twindle is projecting a magic, he struggled to say, aura, to protect us from his influence. Ham then waved a dismissive hand. That is a misconception that Phalanders have about fiends. Kazan does not actually control us. We're just as likely to attack him as we are anyone else, for he doesn't bear the curse. He can guide lesser-minded hordes to locations he wants assaulted, and he does have a few particularly powerful fiends under his control. But his power is not absolute. Tolak seemed able to control you and these others just fine. Hoplite argued. You're lying. Ham shook his head. Tolak promised them all reliefs to their pains if they bound themselves to him. I was one of them, but now I am free. These other mutants couldn't knowingly consent to an agreement like that. Hoplite replied curtly. They can't even form basic sentences. It's impossible that they'd be able to understand any sort of deals. Tolak didn't offer this deal with words, Ham said with a frown, eyes seeming to grow distant a moment before.